How's it going, everybody? I'm Dave Glavin, an aspiring NBA salary cap strategist, and today I'll be discussing how the Chicago Bulls navigated this most recent trade deadline and how that will change their approach this summer. So let's get right into it. I'm going to quickly run through each of the 7 trades that they made and how they were structured in order to take advantage of existing trade exceptions as well as generate new ones. First deal, they took in Dario Saric into their prior Zach LaVine trade exception that they had generated last deadline. They helped facilitate Cleveland sending DeAndre Hunter to Sacramento. They got 2 second-round picks for helping out. The first, 2027, Denver second, and the other one was the least favorable in 2029 of Detroit, Milwaukee, and the Knicks. And to satisfy the touch rule, they sent Emmanuel Miller, a two-way player, to Cleveland. They waived Javon Carter as a result so that they could have the roster spot for Dario Saric. He wasn't a Bull for long. They packaged him and Kevin Huerter to Detroit in a 3-team deal that brought back Mike Conley from Minnesota and Jaden Ivey from Detroit. They structured this in 3 separate trades so that they could generate a pretty nice trade exception, almost $18 million for Huerter's outgoing salary. They took Ivy into their non-tax mid-level and used the expanded trade exception with Dario Saric's outgoing salary to bring in Mike Conley. Third deal was Nikola Vucevic going to Boston for Anthony Simons and a 2026 most favorable second from Minnesota, New Orleans, the Knicks, and the Trailblazers. That looks like it's going to be the Pelicans pick, which seems to be pretty good value for Vooch. It's a top 35 pick and Simons expiring. I'll talk a little bit more about Simons' potential future in Chicago, but I do like the value that you get for Vooch there, just given his age. I think their biggest move of the deadline was this next trade with Charlotte. They sent Kobe White and Mike Conley, who they had just gotten from Minnesota, to Charlotte for Colin Sexton, Ousmane Dieng, and 2 2031 second-round picks, one from Charlotte and one from the Knicks. This was structured as 2 separate trades as well in order to generate roughly $6 million trade exception for White's outgoing salary. And then they used that expanded trade exception to bring in Colin Sexton with Conley's outgoing salary. Shout out to Yossi Goslin for explaining this structure to me. He's got the best salary cap information and resources on the internet, so check his channel out. Check his Third Apron Substack out and capsheets.com. Their 5th move was purely financially motivated. They were helping facilitate New York bringing in Jose Alvarado. So they took in Gershon Yabusele and they sent Dalen Terry to New Orleans and got $500,000 as a result. And Yabusele declined his 2026-27 player option with some reports of a potential EuroLeague return there. So he's essentially on an expiring deal. I don't think they would have done the trade if he hadn't waived that player option. 6th move, they sent Ayo Dosunmu and Julian Phillips to Minnesota for Rob Dillingham and Leonard Miller, as well as 4 second-round picks. 2026, least favorable of Denver and Golden State. 2027, Cleveland second. 2031, most favorable of Golden State and Minnesota. And 2032, most favorable of Houston and Phoenix. I think it's a solid return for both sides. Dosunmu's having a career year. And they're buying low on Rob Dillingham as a second draft guy. I just think that you're going to have to give Dillingham and Miller the developmental minutes that they'll need to really see what you have. Last but not least, they flipped Ousmane Dieng, which they had gotten from Charlotte, to Milwaukee in a 3-team deal with Phoenix that brought Nick Richards to Chicago into that Kobe White trade exception that they had just generated. Leaves them with about $1.2 million left on that. And they also generate a new one for Ousmane Dieng's outgoing almost $6.7 million salary there. Not a fan of this move. I'd much rather take a flyer on Jang, where you're not really set on the wing, um, and give a two-way guy like Lachlan Olbrich, I believe I'm pronouncing that right, some developmental minutes. But I understand you need some center depth after sending Vooch out, but I just don't see much upside in Richards really at all. But you're betting on being able to use the larger trade exception as opposed to just the initial white one that you generated. I listened to Arturas Karnisovas press conference a few times over, and it was clear that the goal was to prioritize their cap space this summer while adding to their asset pool and getting younger in the process. And they were able to do that. They took back mostly expiring contracts and were net +8 in second round picks. But let's take a look at the state of the roster now and how they should approach this summer. So after accounting for the cap hold of their first round pick, which at the time of this filming is projected to be 10th, they have 10 roster spots filled with over $65 million in cap space and 2 second round picks in this draft as well that are not in this projection. The books are pretty clean. They've got one negative asset in Patrick Williams, who's entering year 3 of a 5-year, $90 million deal. Okoro, Jalen Smith, and potentially Leonard Miller on expiring contracts for next season. And that's only if Leonard Miller's team option is picked up. 5 of their 6 notable free agents were deadline acquisitions: Simons, Ivy, who's restricted, Sexton, Richards, and Yabusele. And Zach Collins is the only other notable free agent for them. Over the next 7 drafts, they have all their first-round picks, as well as an additional first from Portland, which still hasn't conveyed from a 2022 trade, I think it was. They have 10 second-round picks as well. That Portland trade could be in this draft, but as of the time of this filming, Portland is outside the top 8, so they would be in the lottery. But if they were to win the play-in, then that pick would convey to Chicago, probably at 15 or 16, somewhere in that range. Depending on how much cap space they use, they'll either have access to the room mid-level exception, which projects to be around $9 million, or the non-tax and biannual combination, which are $15 million and about $5.5 million respectively, assuming a 7% growth of the cap. As far as their direction, you've got 2 young building blocks in Josh Giddey and Matas Buzelis, so finding pieces that fit around them should be the priority. Coming into the season, Billy Donovan talked about how they needed to generate more possessions, whether that's through offensive rebounding or generating turnovers on the defensive end, because despite shooting it well, they were getting outshot by their opponents. It's been more of the same this season. They're top 10 in effective field goal percentage offensively, but they're bottom 5 in offensive rebound percentage, and they're the least disruptive defense in the league in terms of turnover percentage and deflections. It's fair to say that improving on that end has to be a focus. If you take a look at every champion since 2020, outside of Denver, they've all been top 10 in defensive rating, with a lot of them being near the top 3, if not the best in the league. So a strong defense is the foundation of any great team. And Karnisovas has talked about patience and not skipping steps as they retool their roster. They're going to have an opportunity this summer to continue building for the future by using some of their cap space to take on undesirable contracts and add additional draft capital in the process. Given that they have bird rights on all their main free agents and they can re-sign them over the cap, I want to first assess some external uses of some of that $60+ million. And to preface, the projections that I'm going to go over will include Chicago declining Leonard Miller's team option. I just feel like he's more of a two-way player at this point, given the lack of NBA experience. Maybe that's because he just wasn't able to find a spot in Minnesota's rotation with them being so good. But could easily see them picking it up. But in this instance, I have them declining it. One guy that stands out to me as a potential trade candidate who's not on a desirable deal is Jonathan Isaac. With Paolo Banchero's max extension kicking in next season, Orlando projects to be just $7 million below the second apron before filling out the rest of their roster. And while they've definitely had some unfortunate injury luck this year, their performance has not warranted that level of spending. Isaac has 3 years, $44 million left on his deal, although not all of that is guaranteed. Every year follows essentially the same guarantee structure, with $8 million guaranteed for next season. And if he plays 52 games in the season prior, it becomes fully guaranteed. Or if he's on the roster the day after free agency moratorium ends, it becomes fully guaranteed. I mentioned that $8 million for next year. That looks very likely to become fully guaranteed in the next couple of weeks, as he's already played 44 games and isn't injured at this point. Chicago could take him in using cap space, along with a 2031 first-round pick swap, top one protected, and a 2030 Milwaukee second, which I believe is the best second-rounder that Orlando would have to offer. Chicago would send a 2033 top 55 protected second-round pick, just a dummy selection to satisfy the touch rule. At his best, Isaac's an elite defender, but he's really struggled to stay on the floor in recent seasons. He doesn't contribute much on the offensive end. Orlando would get below the tax entirely by clearing his $14.5 million salary, which would give them a lot more flexibility to fill out the rest of their roster. That may be a rich price to pay for a salary dump, including a first-round pick swap, but especially given the flexible structure of his deal with the non-guarantees in there. So I could also see 3 to 4 second-round picks being the compensation, but they don't have a ton of them to send, and with sending out first-round picks in that Bain deal, you need second-round picks to have cheaper labor for those years where you're paying Franz, Paolo, Desmond Bain, and Suggs $30+ million, which is starting next year. Indiana sticks out to me as another team who's going to be looking to shed salary this summer in order to field a team below the luxury tax, which they're known for not paying. As of right now, they're about $6 million below that line, and that's before filling out the rest of their roster, and it doesn't include a projection for keeping their first-round pick, which at the time of the recent Zubac acquisition was essentially a coin flip. Regardless, they have 2 former 2023 first-round picks, Jarris Walker and Ben Shepherd, who are expendable due to their offensive struggles. I don't think they'd be a part of their playoff rotation. And moving their combined roughly $13 million in salary would give Indiana some much-needed breathing room below the tax, especially in a scenario where they end up with a top 4 pick. In this specific projection, I have Chicago taking in both players using cap space, along with a 2028 Indiana and Phoenix most favorable second and a 2033 Indiana second, while sending back a 2026 Denver Golden State least favorable second, which is the other pick that they received for taking in Saric at the deadline. In this scenario, Chicago would waive Ben Shepherd. Just don't feel like he's been impactful enough at the NBA level. But I could also see them keeping him. If Indiana were to lose their pick to the Clippers, they'd have some space to take back a guy like Colin Sexton in a sign and trade. This would hard cap them at the first apron, but again, it doesn't matter if you're not going to pay the tax. With the loss of Mathurin, they need to backfill his bench scoring. And as a veteran, I think Sexton would play that role pretty well and give them more defensively than Mathurin did. And Chicago would be able to generate a trade exception for his outgoing salary, which in this example was $12 million. But again, there would not be an opportunity for this if Indiana keeps their pick. If they were to bring in those 3 guys, that would leave Chicago with about $45 million remaining in cap space. And there's definitely more players who I think are going to be on the move this summer or at the deadline next season for financial reasons. A couple that come to mind are Zeke Naji in Denver, who has kind of played himself into becoming tradable, as well as a couple guys in Charlotte, depending on what they do this summer. Josh Green, Grant Williams, Trey Mann are all on contracts that are not that great and expiring as well. And then in Toronto, Jakob Poeltl and RJ Barrett are on pretty significant deals. Barrett would be expiring, but I know they had mentioned potentially being active at the deadline and didn't do anything linked to a couple notable guys. But for now, let's look at how Chicago could fill out the remainder of the roster. I'm going to show all the moves at once, but I'm going to talk through each one individually. With such a gifted playmaker like Josh Giddey, having shooting around him is pretty essential. And after trading Kevin Huerter, they don't have the prototypical shooter on the roster. And I think Simone Fontecchio is one of the better shooters available this summer in free agency and could fit well in Chicago. I project him here to get a 2-year, $20 million deal with a partial $2 million guarantee on year 2, as well as a team option for some team protection. Some comparable deals include Duncan Robinson, who Detroit signed and traded for Fontecchio, actually, last offseason. They brought in Robinson, sending Fontecchio out, but he's a bit younger, better defensively, had a similar one-year structure with non-guaranteed money on the back end for team protection. Luke Kennard is another example. He just got a one-year, $11 million deal with Atlanta. This past offseason was just traded to the Lakers. And I think Sam Merrill would be at the lower end of this group, which could be some negotiating power for Chicago to get Fontecchio at a lower number. But I think his deal was just more wanting to stay in Cleveland, and outperforming that this season makes it look a lot better than when it was signed. As I had mentioned before, any instance where Chicago is going to sign an external free agent, they're going to want to do that before signing their own, just because they have their bird rights and they can go over the cap to re-sign those guys. Starting with Anthony Simons, I think he's their Kobe White replacement. It's a bit tough to value him just given the league-wide trend against the smaller score-first guards, but I think if he were to go on the open market in free agency, he would get the full non-tax mid-level given his three-point shooting ability. So in this instance, I have Chicago kind of inflating the year one salary, both to entice him to take their offer over a potential full non-tax mid-level offer, which is about $15 million this offseason, as well as to take advantage of some of the available cap space that they do have. Be a 3-year, $51 million deal. While he's been a starter in Portland, I think he showed in Boston what his ideal role is in today's NBA, and that's a microwave scorer off the bench as a six-man. Some comparable deals include Malik Monk, Grayson Allen, and Karis LeVert, with the latter getting the full non-tax mid-level last offseason. I think Simons is above that. I spoke a bit in the beginning about how much I like the flyer that they're taking on Jaden Ivey. I felt like he never fit well next to Cade, at least when he struggled to shoot from deep. But then after the injury, he was just never really able to get in sync with that group. He complements Giddey well if that shot holds up, just given how much he competes on the defensive end. And I think given the low sample size post-injury, I don't see a long-term contract agreement this summer. But I believe a similar structure to the Kuminga deal would be beneficial for both sides, waiving that implicit no-trade clause. In this scenario, he gets about 10% of the cap with a team option on year 2-year, about $34 million deal. This structure allows him to make about $3 million more than his qualifying offer would give him, and he retains his bird rights in any trade. We saw the squeeze on restricted free agents last summer with guys like Quentin Grimes and Cam Thomas accepting their qualifying offer. I don't expect as much disagreement between the two sides in Ivey's case, just where he had this significant injury. So I don't think there's going to be as much of a difficult negotiation. I also have them re-signing Zach Collins to fill their last roster spot. Gives them some extra center depth. I believe I actually had him at $5 million, not $4 million. But given a guy like Deron Sharp, who got over $6 million average annual value last offseason, I think $5 million is fair. Team option on year 2. As far as the other free agents that they had, if there's no sign and trade scenario for Colin Sexton, I just don't see a reunion if they were to also bring back Simons and Ivey, given their depth at that position. I have them renouncing the rights to Yabusele and Richards, but either of those two could fill the Collins slot if he were to go elsewhere. I just feel like where they're a bit undersized at that position with Smith, I think having a 7-footer would be important. And I'm not sure. I think Richards is below 7 feet. But as for the two-way slots, I penciled in Ulbrich returning two-way guy. Miller, who, again, I think would be a good two-way player. He's dominated in the G League. He just really hasn't played a ton at the NBA level. And then their second rounder this season, which is looking to be a top 35 pick. This projection would put them about $9 million above the cap line. Plenty of breathing room against the luxury tax. Still have your full non-tax mid-level and biennial exception, as well as a host of different trade exceptions that you could use to increase payroll and increase your asset pool as well. I appreciate anybody who tuned in. I'm going to be analyzing the Maverick situation next, specifically how they can operate in their first offseason, building around Cooper Flagg. I'm so excited for that. Tune in for that one next. Thank you.